So now let's talk about minimum wages. And with minimum wages, it tends to be the case where there's always a lot of discussion about them. They're always, what should the minimum wage be, and who are we trying to help? And with all that, it's always a lot of arguments for and against increasing the minimum wages. And so let's look at that. So in general, with the downward sloping labor demand curve, minimum wage will force firms to raise the wages of the lowest paid workers. And with that downward sloping demand, if the wage goes up, the quantity demanded is going to go down. Now, because workers tend to have, since these workers tend to be more on the unskilled side, what's going to happen is that they will have larger or more elastic demand. And so you're going to see relatively large decreases in employment from those increases in wage. And when that's happening, aggregate earnings is actually going to go down in theory. Now, the problem is that wages are nominal, meaning they're not adjusted for inflation. So during years between changes, what tends to happen is that inflation actually decreases the real wages. And so if the minimum wage stays the same for 10 years, but prices are going up, the real wage is going down over that time. Real minimum wages also are going to vary by area. So they tend to be lower in states like Alaska that have high prices, and they tend to be lower in Mississippi, which has low prices. And so it's predicted that job losses due to minimum wage hold other factors constant. So let's look at an example here. And let me click this off here. Okay. So let's say that we are currently at, and let me do a different color here. We're currently at D0, and at D0 we're in year 0, and so here's our demand, and our wage is currently W0 over P0. So if you remember, the real wage is the wage divided by the price. So in year 0, when the wage is W0 over P0, there's going to be E0. Oops, I don't have that there. Let's say it's D. There's going to be D units of labor that are employed. Now, let's say there's no change in the minimum wage. It would be expected that wages would go up by the same amount, and the real wage, in theory, in this example, would be the same. So wages would go up by the same as prices. Okay. Now again, this is not actually the case, but this is what happens. This is just an example. So in that case, if wages go up by the same percentage as prices, the wages in year 1 and the price of year 1, that real wage is going to stay the same as in year 0. So if wages go up by 2% and prices go up by 2%, the real wage is unchanged. Right. So now let's assume that in year 1, there's a new minimum wage established, and that new wage is greater than the current. And so let's say it's W2, so the nominal wage goes up to W2, and so W2 over P1 is going to be greater than W1 over P1. So the real wage is going to be higher. Well, let's also assume, though, that the economy has expanded. Okay? And so if the economy has expanded, let's say we went to D1, which is common. The economy is constantly expanding. Okay? Well, what happens is that, so in year 0, we are at this point Z. In year 1, right? In year 1, we are going to be at this B. Okay. Well, the employment went up, but it can be overstated, because what happened is you're assuming that people assume that, okay, well, the minimum wage went up from W1 to W2, And during that time, employment went up from D to B. The problem with this, however, is that you can't really look at it that way. You have to see what would have employment been if it was if there was no change in the minimum wage. And so if the wage stayed here, all right, with the new economic growth, we'd be at area C. So instead of there being an increase from D to B, in reality, C is where we would have been without the increased minimum wage, and B is where we're at. And so there's actually a decrease in employment from the minimum wage from C to B. So now let's look at the effects of minimum wages on what are called covered versus uncovered sectors. So when it comes to minimum wage laws, some sectors are covered by those laws and some are not. And so, for example, if you work at a restaurant as a server, you can be paid, I think it's like $2.13 an hour or something like that, okay, which is clearly less than minimum wage. So what happens is that those sectors get affected. So let's see what happens. So let's look at a sector that is covered by the minimum wage first. And so here we have the covered sector. Well, let's say that the wage was W0C in both the covered sector and the uncovered. So assume that there's the same wage before in both. Well, what happens is the wage went up from W0C, the minimum wage, to W1C. So this is going to be your minimum wage. Well, when that happens, if the firms can't do any more than that, or if they can't sell any, or if they can't set a wage any less than that, then this E1C is going to be the number of people that are demanded. So what happens is the employment is going to go down from E0C to E1C. Well, now what happens is you have this uncovered sector. The sector where they don't have to go up to this, whatever this W1C is. They don't have to. All right, they don't have to worry about it. And so what can happen here is, this is where it is. All right, let's say that this wage is determined by, so we have our supply. What happens now is because of the minimum wage, there was a decrease in employment. So these are more people now who are unemployed. And so they have to go and start to look elsewhere. Well, where do they go? They're going to go to the uncovered sector. And so the supply of workers in the uncovered sector is going to go up. And in this case, sorry, that should be in parallel, the supply is going to increase. And so in the uncovered sector, there's actually going to be a decrease in the minimum wage. Or sorry, there's going to be a decrease in the actual wage because there's going to be more supply. So what happens is when we are looking at a minimum wage, there tends to be a general movement of workers from the sector that gets impacted by it or covered by it to sectors that are not covered by it. Back in here. So now if we talk about minimum wage and poverty. So hypothetically, minimum wage was aimed at fighting poverty. In theory, however, it does not. Now, the adverse effect on low wage earners discussed is that, sure, the wage goes up, but because they have highly elastic demand, there's a large decrease in the workers' demand, and so aggregate earnings actually go down. The other problem with minimum wage is that most people who live in poverty are unaffected because many of them are unemployed, and if you're unemployed, you're not affected by the minimum wage increase. Others make, because of the way the poverty rates are set up, the minimum wage is well below what's needed, what's called a living wage. And so people, may still be making more than minimum wage and living in poverty. And even when that minimum wage goes up, they might still not be. Or they still not be making or affected by it. So it may not impact them. So what has been, minimum wages are too low in states. And so some states have adopted what are called living wages. And so these are determined to be wages that you need to survive to get you above the poverty rate or some other method. So there's benefits. These are more beneficial than minimum wages, but they affect a narrower group of workers. And so they don't quite have the same impact. They don't affect as many workers as you may think they would. The other thing to talk about here is technology. Now, technology so far has been ignored. In this economy, technological advances are constantly happening. And when that happens, the machines, the capital becomes more productive. And you're able to substitute a little more or in areas where you otherwise weren't. Now, there's two aspects that technology change affects. First, the product demand. This is the scale effect. And so with that, let me take this off here. So with that, if technology goes up, it's going to cause the cost of, let's say, CK, cost of capital go down, which is going to cause the price of the good, the price of the good goes down, and so the quantity demand of the good to go up. And so there's more demand for both capital and labor. And so that increases the demand for labor. There's your scale effect. But the problem, though, is that the increase in technology is also going to make labor, relatively speaking, more expensive. All right, well, that didn't come out at all like I wanted to. But anyway, so what it does is it decreases the cost of capital, and so there's an increase in the demand for capital, but a decrease in the demand for labor. So if we look what we have here, we have two separate effects. So the scale effect from better technology is an increase in demand for labor, but the substitution effect is a decrease. So if the scale effect dominates, the inputs are gross complements, and if the substitution effects dominates, then they're gross substitutes. And I discussed this a little bit before, but normally unskilled labor and capital are gross substitutes, but skilled labor and capital are gross complements. Okay. So the problem is that most analysis has really focused on just the substitution effect when it comes here. But if that was the case, then jobs would constantly shrink. So you would think that if the substitution effect was only in play, to whereas better technology means that you would substitute more capital for labor because of that, then jobs just be getting less. But it's not the case. Change in technology does negatively affect some workers, but there are significant scale effects because of that, because it becomes cheaper to produce, and so they're able to produce more. And so are society as a whole better or worse off? It's unknown long run, but this just gives you an idea that it's not quite black and white.